This week on The Futurists, the London Futurists join us. David Wood and Calum Chace are here.
We shouldn't be trying to go back to the 1700s or the 1950s or the 1970s, some previous vision of the good life. There's a much better life ahead of us if we can see it and wisely navigate to it.
Hi, I'm Brett King. Welcome back to The Futurists. Joining me from LA is my co-host, Rob Tercek. Hey, Rob.
Hi.
So this is going to be a good one. This is going to be fun. You know, we're going to have 4 futurists on the show. Have we ever done 4? Well, we've done live streams with 4, but we haven't done a show with 4.
Yeah.
Oh, we haven't. Maybe a couple, but this is great. So joining us all the way from Old Blighty is, well, not really, because you guys are across the kingdom, but we have the London Futurists. So I'm sure if you know the Futurist podcast space, these guys have been around for a long time. And the hosts of the show are David Wood and Calum Chace. David and Calum, welcome to the Futurists. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Glad to be with you.
We're honored to join you guys.
Thanks for joining us today.
Where are you joining us from?
I'm just outside London.
Okay.
A short walk from the River Thames.
Good.
And I'm in the south of Spain, looking out the window at Gibraltar and Morocco.
All right. So the other part of the UK.
That other bit
the
of the
holiday
UK,
part. Yeah.
And and what's the prospect for the future? When your vantage point is London, what does it look like? Is it exciting? Is it optimistic? Is it pessimistic? Is it dystopian? What's the general tenor of the future these days in the UK?
It's still one of the world's greatest cities. There's so much happening there. There's academia, there's entertainment, there's finance, there's politics, there's numerous startups. It may not be quite the startup capital of the world, but my goodness, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, tons of AI talent as well coming out of the universities.
There was also
tons of AI talent. It's had the bloom brushed off it by Brexit, of course, and so London is now perhaps has lost its crown to New York as being the capital of the world, but it's still a great place. And the good news is that we're getting rid of the criminals and clowns who've done so much damage over the last decade. Not entirely sure what's coming next, but the Tories are on their way out. Hooray!
Well, Farage has stuck his head up again, so that is not encouraging for me. But anyway,
no, he's not great, but he's certainly not going to be in government next. He might take the political right even further into its grave. That might happen, but he's not going to actually get his hands on.
No, he's not going to be policy setting. So thank goodness. So
there is an interesting point here, which is that politics has changed faster than most people had expected. I remember when Boris Johnson was elected with an apparent landslide in 2019, people said, well, that defines politics for the next 10 years. So much changes more quickly, and that's part of the acceleration of society. It's not just technology that changes, it's ideas change, and people readjust their identities more quickly. So it's quite possible we'll have quite a few more changes in the next 5 years that we can't yet anticipate in terms of politics.
Part of that change what Johnson's rapid rise and fall shows is that populists like him have no good answers to anything, and so they do collapse very suddenly. And if we're lucky, what the UK is about to do in getting rid of our clowns is a good signal to the rest of the world, and most especially to America, which is, of course, the place where the election matters more than anywhere else.
Hear, hear. I hope that we're inspired by the UK example. Let's hope that's true. Do you think that the next government will have better ideas about how to manage the UK's future?
Well, I've listened to their prospective health secretary, and he's very clear that you can't solve the problems of healthcare just by spending more money and doing more of the same. He focuses on prevention rather than just cures, focuses on accelerating digitization, and focuses on bringing healthcare closer to the people in the community rather than people going off to large, massive hospitals. So that's one example of where I think there is a lot of insight. Well, wait and see how it works out. The devil's in the detail. There's going to be a few shocks and horrors along the way, but I think there's enough good people there with boldness to do things a bit differently.
Is healthcare a primary issue?
Up to a point.
Is that a big issue?
There isn't really anybody in UK governing circles who's taking AI very seriously. Oddly, with the slight exception of Sunak, who was possibly the first major world politician to talk about existential risk. But the UK isn't taking AI very seriously. And it's really concerning that in this year,
the
when half
EU
the
at
world
least
is
has
voting,
regulation around it, and China.
they have regulation, but they're not actually, contributing to the industry very much.
Yeah,
and
true.
Despite the fact that half the world is going to the polls this year, AI is not on the ballot. AI is not on the agenda.
And climate
anywhere.
really isn't. It was in Spain, right, or Mexico.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it's
here in the U.S. the big issues are inflation and border control, or immigration, which is really just a red herring. Right? That's just a divisive issue that splits the electorate. So it's useful to instrument that as a political weapon. But I don't really think there's a tremendous immigration problem in the United States. So it seems fictitious. So we seem to be occupied by these populist trends and these themes that inflame the electorate, but they aren't really very pertinent to the future, as I understand it. I could be corrected. Perhaps there is some implication of these issues that I should be more aware of. But I think the points that you're raising are important. That the very big decisive matters, we don't seem to have any executive focus on.
So I will tell you something, a stat from the book I did in 2021, The Rise of Technosocialism. So we researched from the 1950s, we researched all of the protests that had happened since the 1950s to 2000, and then from 2000 onwards. And in the first 20 years of this century, the rate of protests have doubled globally from the 50-year average of the 20th century. And that includes like the Iraq War and, Vietnam War and so forth. So big civil rights movement in the States and so forth. So already doubled, but the participation rate had increased tenfold. So that's the outcome of this sort of political instability that we find now. People have this uncertainty about the future. That's very clear, and that is seen as economic uncertainty, but it's really uncertainty about what the future holds. It's not predictable anymore.
True.
But uncertainty drives people into the hands of the populists who offer easy solutions.
Yes.
I remember a big mistake I made in foresight in 2014, 2015. I was talking about the future of politics, and I had access to data about what was on the electorate's mind. And the number one issue did seem to be immigration. And I sort of poo-pooed it aside. I said, well, what were they really thinking about is healthcare and the strength of the economy. But it turned out that people were concerned about immigration because they were feeling uncertain. And in times of uncertainty, we tend to retract ourselves into a simpler worldview and we blame the outsiders.
Yes.
I think we may see more of this. If there's more uncertainty without a clear path forwards, people are more inclined to blame the outsiders, and we'll end up with more walls. And that is a trend we need to pay attention to. Just as there is more abundance, sadly, there are people who perceive themselves to be missing out. It's too hard for them to afford good housing. It's too hard for them to afford good education. It's too hard for them to afford good healthcare.
But this is no longer the minority, David. This is the point, right? In the United States, over half the renters say they can't afford to rent anymore. Right, Robert and I were talking about this on last week's show, and you've got you've got this permanent renter class. If you look at my hometown, back in Australia in Sydney, and you look at Sydney, and you can see there that there's only about 28% of the youth who will ever be able to afford to own their own home that of sort of the Gen Z growing up now in Australia. It's just completely unaffordable for the majority of these kids. So I mean, that's we're creating sort of these class systems again, almost like the days of the lords of old,
Yanis Varoufakis doesn't talk about techno-socialism. He talks about techno-feudalism.
Techno-feudalism. Yeah, we had him on the show.
We had Yanis on the show. Brett, where you and David seem to be going is you've raised this topic of populism, right? So these charismatic populist leaders can kind of generate a fervor among the electorate and drive them towards really impractical solutions. Usually they involve splitting the electorate, finding a group to blame. Sometimes that's immigrants, sometimes it's other people, but we're seeing that happen around the world now, where there's a group that's isolated or singled out and sort of identified as the villain or the enemy. What we're not seeing is class warfare, but Brett, what you just pointed to is the notion that people who have capital are accumulating capital more rapidly than working people whose wages seem to be stagnating, and that is a class issue. But that never seems to be the way the politics unfold. I think it's laughably easy to pit working people against each other and to split the working class and divide it.
It's happening everywhere. Yeah. It happened in the UK. It's happened in Australia. It's happened in the States. It's happening in Germany.
Populism
right now.
is a fairly well trodden path, and we've seen several cycles of it. The first ones were in America in the late 1800s, and it was actually called the Populist Party. And the theme is always the same. The theme is a metropolitan elite has stolen the birthright from the majority of the population, and I, the populist, and please ignore the fact that I am from a metropolitan elite myself, I, the populist, will defeat the metropolitan elite. I will crush them. I will drain the swamp, and I will give you back your birthright. And of course, it doesn't work. It fails. And so populists always flame out in one of two ways. They either flame out like Joe McCarthy by becoming utterly ridiculed and disgraced and disappearing into the sunset. And he died a couple of years after his height as a heroin addict, actually. Or they flame out in war because they gain power. Right. And because their solutions don't work, they have to find an even bigger enemy to blame. And so they have to have a war. And Putin's having his now. The real danger, of course, is, if Trump wins, he has a war against China. That's the really scary thing, the way the world could go.
Well,
hopefully,
it's also,
as I say, in the British elections, maybe we're showing ours the door, and we will help other countries to do the same.
I mean, Germany's got the right-wing party a big chance of getting in there. In the German election.
Alternative für Deutschland is scary. This is
Trump
no one expected fascists to be back in Germany.
And Trump's not out of contention. He's still the leading Republican candidate. And we don't.
He's got
really
the whole party lined up behind him. Okay, let's see. Well, somehow we've ended up on politics. What I wanted to talk about was the way we first crossed paths, David, a long time ago in the mid 2000s when you were running Symbian. And for the folks who are listening who aren't familiar with Symbian, that was the operating system. It was the first open source operating system for mobile devices, and it really paved the way to the modern smartphones that we have today. Around that time, around 2008, you started London Futurists. I think I've got the date right. Why don't you tell me about the how you organized London Futurists, and then let's talk for a few minutes about that time, what was going on in 2008, and what we thought the future would hold in the 2010s.
These are huge topics, but let me see what I can do quickly. When I lived for 25 years in the early days of the mobile computing and smartphone industries, and it was slow, it was disappointing, it was frustrating. My wife almost divorced me because I was working so hard and nothing was coming of it. And then it started happening much more quickly. And then it started happening even more quickly and more decisively. And it was my perception in due course that what had happened with mobile computing and smartphones was going to play out with even larger technologies, that what was happening with reprogramming our silicon would in due course happen with reprogramming our biology and reprogramming our intelligence with AI. So I said, well, let's start thinking about this. There are some fascinating writers like Ray Kurzweil and James Hughes and Eric Drexler who've said fascinating things about this. Let's have a serious discussion as to what we might expect. So the motto of London Futurists was serious analysis of radical scenarios for the future. Emphasis on serious because there are lots of futurists who are in this business for entertainment or for provocation, and they give the rest of us a bad name in reality because it doesn't pan out. Whereas what I've been trying to do in London Futurists is say, well, we can't be sure, but here's a trend. And if we look at this trend, we can't be sure when it's going to accelerate, but there's good reason to think in due course it will accelerate. And most of what I spoke about in the early days of London Futurists, some of it happened faster than I expected. Some of it's happened a lot slower, like Google Glass. I was telling everybody in 2010 that we'd all be wearing Google Glass by 2012, and how wrong that was. It turned out that the hardware was much more problematic and the software was much more problematic. But it will come in due course. And so that's basically why I set up London Futurists. So we would anticipate, before being shocked by the future, we'd develop futurist muscles.
At the time, the thinking was that, as we could push compute power from, let's say, desk-bound machines or mainframes or workstations, push that power into mobile devices, the whole industry assumed that the next stage would be to push it into even smaller devices, wearable devices, maybe something that could be implanted in your skin or something that could be implanted in the body. There were even ingestible computer concepts. I remember very clearly from that time.
The Proteus. Yes.
And then the other idea was hyperconnectivity, connecting everything. So the Internet of Things, or the industrial internet that people were calling it at that time. And there was a great deal of hope around that. Smart devices, things like smart speakers that you could talk to, smart lighting systems you could talk to. Now, candidly, a lot of this stuff did not work out. It didn't work out as we expected. Part of that is because hardware is hard. But part of it is also because these ideas were half-baked and they weren't very well implemented, and it was kind of early. Things have changed, though, in the last 10 years. And now it does appear that we're starting to converge on a kind of networked intelligence that can drive all these connected things. The compute power will be in the cloud, so you don't need so much processing power on devices. Tell me about how you're thinking about devices and distributed computing and hyperconnectivity have evolved since 2010.
Well, we do have a lot of distributed computing. Many people are wearing smartwatches. I look around and very few people are using old-fashioned watches these days. And wearing smart rings as well. There are smart tags all over the place. So it took longer than expected, but it is now becoming decisive. And it's hoovering up data all over the place, which may be good, it may be bad. If we are being spied on by governments, by corporations, by possible enemies, there are dangers there too. So this is happening. But it's happening according to Demi Moore's law, if I can use this.
Demi Moore's law.
So it is the idea that change happens initially at half the pace you might expect it from a straightforward reading of an exponential curve. Why? Because although the technology might improve along a smooth exponential curve, the applications often take longer to put in place. Why? Because you need a whole ecosystem to come. With mobile phones, you needed networks as well as devices. With smart mobile phones, you needed retailers who understood smart phones. You needed application developers. You needed platforms. You needed developer tools. You needed app stores. There was a lot that needed to come into place, and it took a lot longer than expected to form that. But when it was there, then it went at twice the pace you might have expected. And so I think it's going to be the same with all this stuff that has been delayed. There will be wider pervasive computing for good and for ill. And it'll take us by surprise when it is happening. And that's what we're seeing with AI too.
Yeah,
AI delayed and disappointed. And then suddenly with GPT 3.5, and then just a few months later, GPT 4, it was doing a heck of a lot more than people had thought. And people had previously said it's going to take 10 years for such and such a metric to be achieved. And even people like Eliezer Yudkowsky, often predicted there would be fast changes. He himself was taken by surprise at how quickly this new technology took off. And so
that's your point is valid. Even with the AI, the great advances in the performance of AI, what we're seeing is lagging is the applications, right? So right now, the generative AI systems are impressive, but they're more like a parlor trick. It's hard to rely on them for any professional application because the output's not predictable and it's not very controllable. We've had a couple different AI experts on the show to talk about why that's the case and if that might change. So it seems to me the next frontier for AI is not necessarily just GPT-5 and a bigger language model, but also practical applications and some kind of agentic workflow that'll make it more useful for people, people in regular professions to apply.
I think there's definitely more of this narrow AI stuff. The industrial AI in particular is making some fairly rapid progress in some areas. The chip technologies, the neuromorphic chipsets and so forth are making progress. We also have 6G in there, which is going to be necessary for sort of low latency networks based on AI. We're also going to have quantum in there for polymorphic encryption technologies and stuff like we talked about the other day, Rob. So, we are going to be increasingly reliant on this tech, but it's like, to David's point, it seems like in the AI thing, particularly right now, is speeding up significantly.
I think there's two more laws worth mentioning. One is Hodgkinson's law, which is that everything takes longer than you think, even when you've taken Hodgkinson's law into account. Right. And the other is Amara's law, which is the very familiar observation that we always overestimate the impact of any new technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term.
Yeah,
and of course, we don't know how long the long term is. Mm-hmm. So LLMs are incredibly powerful and incredibly effective, but they're really quite new. I mean, it's only March last year that GPT-4 was announced, and that's the one that's really effective. And Microsoft, I heard recently, is spending $1 billion with each of three of the big four accounting firms, and each of those firms is spending another $1 billion to develop LLMs that they can use routinely in their audits. And when that money, bears fruit, and no doubt 90% of it will be wasted, but when that money bears fruit, there's going to be a really high degree of automation in the audit process, which is a business process which deserves to be automated because it's crucifyingly boring for humans to do. And I think we are going to see in the next couple of years, LLMs deployed widely and very effectively in industry, which didn't happen with the previous generation of deep learning because you needed such smart AI wranglers to deal with the algorithms along with the massive amount of data and the massive amount of compute. I think LLMs is the thing that's really going to get proper AI deployed in industry on a wide scale basis.
There's certainly enough investment going into it, certainly enough. Yeah.
I guess the point there is there's a shift to practical application that's happening. We can see that happening right now. This is 2024, so it's not the distant future that's unfolding right in front of us. Surely more powerful models will make that'll happen faster at a larger scale. One of the things, David, that I noticed that's changed since we first met in the 2000s is the scale of technology. And I don't just mean the size of the tech companies, though that's certainly a factor. You probably remember Chris Gent when he was at Vodafone. He laughed at AOL and said, does he realize how small AOL is? And that was when AOL was the dominant internet company, around 2000, yeah. I think. And at the time, his point was that Vodafone had global reach, et cetera, and they were going to be the dominant player. Today, I don't think anyone could take that statement seriously about any telecom operator in the world. They've become almost irrelevant infrastructure. There's certainly not a decisive factor in anyone's planning, including for wireless now, where people are launching their own private 5G networks and LoRa networks and so forth. They don't really need to rely on telecoms anymore.
And we've now got the constellations, the satellite constellation systems.
That's right. There's ways to work around telecom. Yeah. So now the new set of gatekeepers are these absolutely massive companies that can afford to deploy tens of billions of dollars. We're hearing about these absolutely extraordinarily large data centers that are being proposed, $100 billion data centers for massive amounts of concentrated compute. So one of the things that's interesting about that is scale still matters. And it does appear that we've reached a point where technology companies are not just too big to fail; they're too big to govern or too big to manage. They're almost sovereign entities unto themselves. Most of the tech companies have market capitalization that exceeds the GDP of most countries on the planet. Okay, so we're going to need to head to a break now, and so folks who are listening, we have the London Futurists on this version of the Futurists, and we'd be very happy to continue the conversation after a short word. Hang tight, we'll be right back.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey there, you're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek with Brett King, and this week we're talking to David Wood and Calum Chace of the London Futurists. Now, David, one of the things that you were most interested in when you started London Futurists was the concept of transhumanism, the idea that technology can not just enhance and extend human longevity, but actually transform human nature. Where does that stand today?
I think it's still coming. There is lots of possibilities to use AI to overcome some of the limitations we've inherited from evolution. Evolution gave us various cognitive biases. We are not very good in calculating various things. So we have collective stupidity and individual stupidity. And AI, if we use it wisely, can help us not to fall into these cognitive traps. More than that, AI can also help us with other technologies to overcome our tendencies towards egotism, depression, alienation, deceptiveness, a lot of things which evolution gave to us to try and help us to propagate our own genes. It leaves us unhappy. It leaves us miserable. I think transhumanism points to the possibility of super happiness. So the super intelligence, super happiness, and we should mention too, super longevity, which doesn't just mean becoming decrepit and holding out for 100 years in a decrepit state. It means going back to our youthfulness again. It means reprogramming aspects of our biology to clean out the junk. As we've lived, we've got damage of all sorts in our bodies, and we can detox, not just in some superficial way, but in a very deep way. We can clean out the damage inside ourselves, the damage between ourselves, and revitalize ourselves. And all of that, I think, is within our grasp. And we've got to decide that there is a better future ahead. We shouldn't be trying to go back to the 1700s or the 1950s or the 1970s or some previous vision of the good life. There is a much better life ahead of us if we can see it and wisely navigate to it.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, we had Aubrey de Grey on the show a while back and talking about, sins and, the process of self-senescence and autophagy and all of those things, caloric reduction and stuff. And, the amount of knowledge we've gained just in those areas. Look at Brian Johnson and other players like that. Now it's in the public domain now. You've got players actually ostensibly working on bioaging, reducing their bioage in real time. And it's expensive, but there are proxies that people can do now, and there's supplements widely available. And, we're talking a lot more about this stuff. It certainly seems like things are heating up in this area.
I think it's still really a minority sport, though. People who take the idea of radical longevity seriously. I live with, people of my own age, and the great majority of them have absolutely no interest in extending their lifespan. I find that terribly sad, but it's true. I'm sure America's a little less benighted, particularly, say, in California, but I think all around the world, very few people are taking the idea of much greater longevity seriously. But of course, that will change very quickly when somebody demonstrates it's definitely possible. Yes. And you mentioned Aubrey de Grey. He, of course, has got this very important experiment happening at the moment, the Robust Mouse Rejuvenation Project, where he's trying to make middle-aged mice, he's trying to double their lifespan. And mice are very different biologically from humans, but they're a model that is used often. And it may well be that experiment or some other experiment happening soon will appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show or something similar. And suddenly a large part of the world will wake up and say, hang on a minute, you mean it really is possible that in a few years we might be able to stop my mum and dad dying, my grandparents dying? That may create an incredible change in the culture. I suspect it will be opposed by a lot of people because they'll say this is a toy for rich people, and religious people will probably oppose it on principle. So I think there's going to be a lot of fear, confusion, and befuddlement. But I think we may be heading towards some really interesting changes.
Aubrey had an interesting, he changed my mind on this. He said he had an interesting perspective, which was if you look at the increasing cost of healthcare, that the lion's share of that comes from elder care. And so if you can create health span and reduce the maladies of aged care, then you're going to, it's trillions of dollars of benefit to the economy. So he said that's why governments would pay for it, which I actually think is a fairly reasonable argument. Before I heard that, I would have said it's just going to be limited to rich people as it is today, and it's just going to get more like that. But there's a fairly good argument, particularly if the economic uncertainty exists, that government might want to cool things down by saying, well, we can give you longevity,
It's certainly one way of getting the accountants who run treasuries to take it seriously. And the other thing that is coming along is people are going to realize before too long that in most of the world, the birth rate is below the natural rate of the replacement. So we need older people to keep alive and healthy longer and working longer, so that we haven't got this shrinking group of young people who are paying for us oldies.
Yeah, but the notion of living longer implies that there's something to live for. And we talked a moment ago about populism and this sort of spreading feeling of fear about the future and despair.
Thanks for being a downer on a really upbeat conversation.
No, I mean, this is where we're at right now. Like, we have these elections coming up. I mean, you can joke about it, of course, but
no, you're right though.
No, it's Pollyanna, right. I think, to say,
it's going to be a lot of chaos,
great, everyone's going to live forever. That. The reality is, I think the reason Calum just pointed out, it's hard for people to grasp the notion of extending lifespan when life is quite hard, right? When people are not figuring out how they can actually manage to pay for the rent this month, it's a little bit difficult to get them to raise their eyes to the horizon. So that's one of the reasons why transhumanism has been viewed as a rich man's sport, because they're the only people that can afford the luxury of thinking about the long term. The point there is simple. If you think government's going to come in and rescue us and extend lifespans, you have to get government in alignment with incentives for people to care about the future and have a stake in the future. What I'm seeing is the opposite right now. These populist movements, they don't care about the future. There's a huge segment of the U.S. electorate that is like, burn the whole thing down, trash the machinery of government. I don't love this. I'm not endorsing it, so don't kill the messenger here, Brett. The point I'm making is simple, that quite a few people feel disaffected and maybe alienated.
I mean, these things go in cycles.
We don't want to get back into politics full time, but these things do go in cycles, and the populists do flame out one way or another. Within 10 years, it is.
Those populist movements are usually followed by a progressive movement, and the progressive movement is about reform. And I think that there's a huge case to be made for reforming government, even the U.S. government. That I'm interested in defending. It is bloated. It is inefficient. It is run by
AI can help us fix some of that stuff. But, the point that Calum made earlier about the rate of population decline, which is something Elon Musk talks frequently about because it concerns him. Mm-hmm. I think that's just economics. I think people don't want to have kids because it's too expensive to have kids.
Yeah, if you're moving to a city like most people.
Yeah,
If you're on a farm,
so maybe give UBI, maybe we'll have more kids. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's a bigger trend.
It's also possible. It's also possible there will be people with artificial wombs. That many women are sort of afraid of having their bodies taken over by a growing child for 9 months and all the ruptures.
Or an American Republican. Yeah.
Yes. So I think it is possible we will have not just changes in how we live and age, but changes in how we give birth. We already have IVF, the logical extension of IVF, if we use synthetic biology wisely, to give people at least a choice if they want. And I think a significant percentage of women would be interested. It's not just it's how they're brought into the world.
We're all supposed to be futurists. I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about how a future world could be wonderful.
Let's
raise the happiness level.
Well,
let's raise our hedonic level.
We always like to finish on the strong, future notes with the upbeat, because yes, there's going to be chaos, but coming through, we can see all of these technologies emerging that will bring us into this higher order of existence, and but the old systems have to sort of collapse a bit for us to make those philosophical improvements as a human race. That's sort of probably the argument, right?
So, Calum, when people look back at this moment, let's say 15 years in the future, the same way we were talking about, the 2000s just a moment ago, let's look back at this moment. What will people say was a decisive thing that occurred in 2024, 2025 that gave us the utopian vision of the future that you're referring to?
Let's say we do have
in the last decade. Yeah.
Let's say we do have a good outcome, and people are around to do that, and that they're living a wonderful life where
we'll grant you that supposition.
Aging has been abolished, and work is no longer. Jobs are no longer necessary. We have an economy of abundance, and humans do whatever we want to do, and we get on terribly well with the AIs, and we're in the process of merging with them, perhaps, or they're our friends, or they're our supporters. Let's say all that happens. I think if people then are looking back at today, I think the first thing they'll think of, good grief, how few people were paying attention to the enormous changes that it was obvious to some of us were coming.
Yes.
But the specific thing I think that they would probably point to most, the specific technologies, is almost certainly got to be the large language models, which have taken the world by storm in the last year and a half. And they are, frankly, astonishing. They're not perfect. You can't rely on the output.
You're going to be talking to your AI. This is going to happen. We see the trajectory.
I already do. Right? I talk to GPT-4o quite a bit. I ask it all sorts of questions. And of course, I wouldn't publish its results without checking, but I find it incredibly useful. And it still amazes me that a bit of software can do what a fresh graduate can do pretty much as well as a fresh graduate can do in seconds, and it can do it at scale. I still think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So if we look ahead at some tipping points, things that go beyond what we've got already, I think we're going to have breakthroughs in AI science, that AI is going to use itself to come up with new theories of science, not just new drugs. That's going to be important too. drugs that will be different from what humans had thought of, but will turn out to be excellent for various diseases. I think it's possible we'll get the theory of everything from AI. Scientists have been struggling for 50 years to reconcile relativity and quantum theory and superstring theories and so on, and they haven't managed. I think it's quite possible in the next 3 or 4 years, an AI is going to come up and say, hey, humans, think of it like this. Instead of complex numbers and quaternions, there's this weird thing called quintonians, or what, I don't know, whatever it's going to be, and it's suddenly going to make sense of the problems of dark matter and so on. That is going to take the world by surprise, and no longer people are going to say, hey, it's just some statistical regularities. It's like AlphaGo was able to play better Go than the AlphaZero was able to play better Go by working it all out by itself than the one that had been trained on human ideas. And so I think these systems will study human ideas of science and then will infer radically new ones. That's one, I think, breakthrough that's quite possible within the next.
There's one other subject I'd like to raise, because it doesn't get very much airplay at all, and that's the idea of conscious AI. The idea of AI is becoming conscious. It's quite possible within the next few years we will develop an AI which is conscious, and if we do, we've really better be aware that it's happened, because otherwise we'll commit mind crime on a massive scale. We could torture it, enslave it, and kill it over and over again, and we must not do that. And it might also be that we want superintelligence to be conscious on the grounds that a conscious superintelligence will understand and appreciate our consciousness, whereas a non-conscious superintelligence wouldn't. So I think that's a really important subject, and I'm part of a risky proposition which is addressing that.
That's like saying humans will appreciate the intelligence level of cockroaches, right? So superintelligence.
We do appreciate the consciousness of other animals. We're much nicer to cows than we are to cockroaches, mainly because we think they're more conscious than cockroaches are.
And also, we've learned, for example, recently that bees play. Right, and things like this. So we can see evidence, like we can see evidence of consciousness in plants now, like in the mycelial network and things like this. It's really, this is, I think, one of the things that AI is going to make us grapple with, is that consciousness is on a spectrum, and what happens when we're down on the spectrum from we're going to have to negotiate then with these.
That's a really interesting thought, that we may create machines which are more conscious than us. And what happens then?
That's certainly an implication of what you're describing. So let me go out on a limb here. I want to build on what both of you have said and see if I can offer a turning point. One of the things I think artificial intelligence and possibly superintelligence can help us achieve is an optimal distribution of resources. And I'd argue that all of the problems that we're experiencing today come from a suboptimal distribution. Namely, a lot of the world's resources go to individuals we call billionaires. And this is one of the stupidest ways to divide resources ever devised by human beings. And we don't seem to be able to solve that problem on our own. We're creating more billionaires. There were a handful of billionaires in 1900. Today, there are almost 3,000 in the world, and there are more than 10 people who have over $100 billion. This is a crazy distribution of wealth when half the population of the planet is struggling to make ends meet. I think an AI would look at this and just say that is a ridiculous way to use the resources of the planet. And a massive redistribution of resources could help us achieve that rosy future that Calum was just talking about a few moments ago.
Yeah.
But I think it'll have to be some kind of synthesis of traditional distribution mechanisms and traditional capitalist mechanisms, because there's wisdom in both traditional right wing and traditional left wing. And we've struggled to get a third way. Everybody talks about, I'm a third way politician. We haven't quite got that. So in the same way that I envisioned an AI might come up with a unification of quantum theory and relativity, I think it's possible an AI will be able to persuade us, hey, this is the right combination of traditional socialism and traditional capitalism, and it's something quite different. And it'll be able to also, ideally, it'll be able to explain to people in ways that each person says, you know what, I was going to resist this, but I know I'm persuaded. So if we get it right, this AI won't just come up with a new system, it'll also be very good at persuading people that this is in everybody's interest to do that. So that's the kind of positive vision there. Of course, there are many things that could go wrong with an AI that's so capable at persuading people. If it's malused, it could persuade us all to sign up for something that will turn out to be terrible. So
or
humans
it
need to
might
keep
look
on
at that
top of that
trend
loop
of
for the time being.
depopulation and say that's actually the best way to solve the distributioning problem is to just have fewer human beings on the planet Earth.
I don't think we need to depopulate. I'm sure that with the technology, with sustainable green energy, with solar power,
we have the technology to solve it, and you know, but we don't have policy. That's all it is. We don't have but this is where we need a new system, because the capitalist system is about the next vote and the next, you know, election cycle and the next quarter, and you're keeping your eye on those numbers rather than looking at these long-term things, and you can't afford to invest in these longer-term things. So you need.
I think it's quite ironic that we got two Brits here who are being more positive about capitalism than two Americans. But hey, that's where we are.
I'm not American.
But I think actually the world is going to. I think we're going to have to revisit these concepts in a very radical way soon, because almost certainly, you know, full-scale automation is going to happen unless we stop building AIs which are smarter and smarter. We'll get to the point, and it isn't centuries away. It may be decades. It may even be years, when AIs and robots that they govern will be able to do pretty much everything we can do for money that we can, and they'll do it cheaper, better, and faster. And at that point, we're going to need a different economic system. Now, personally, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think we should get rid of the market. I think it's going to be some adaptation of capitalism rather than a complete overthrow of it. But we're going to be in a world in which enormous wealth is being created, but the great majority of people won't be involved in that creation. They won't have jobs. Most of us will hopefully have a very nice standard of living, but we'll be doing whatever we want to do. We'll have fun. We'll explore. We'll socialize. We'll learn. We'll travel. We need to figure out what that economy looks like. And I had a go in my book, The Economic Singularity, but it's a hard problem. And one of the things that worries me most of all is that so few people are thinking about futurist issues that we haven't got a big proportion of humanity's marvelous brain power applied to this most important problem. And that's the thing. That's the reason why I'm in this game, is I'm trying to get more people to think about these problems.
It's a lot easier to get people ginned up to resist the future than it is to get them to embrace it.
Yeah.
What do you do as London Futurists to encourage your countrymen to focus on the future and embrace the future? What are some of the things that our audience might consider doing?
Well, it's painting scenarios which can be seen to be credible, scenarios in which things go well, scenarios in things which go badly, and making people realize this isn't just some weird science fiction with no connection to the present state. So that's what I try to do anyway, to point credible extrapolations, not futurist porn that, wow, this is astonishing, but hey, this
forecasting.
Super forecasting. That's right.
So a kind of practical futurism or pragmatic futurism.
Yeah.
Yeah,
what would that entail? Like, what are some?
I edited a book called Stories from 2045, which had a series of optimistic scenarios, how things might pan out, and a series of pessimistic scenarios. And it's interesting. It was much harder to get people to contribute the pessimistic scenarios. It's much easier to write about dystopia. It's hard to write
the wrong way
about.
around.
Actually, David Brin,
positive scenarios,
David Brin, the sci-fi legend, we've had him on the show a few times. He made a really interesting point about that. He said, you know why things are changing now? Because he said, because of the advances in computer graphics, we can now do utopian shows, but they were too expensive to do before. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective.
Well, we're big fans of David Brin, and I hope he's right about that.
Yeah. Well, certainly with generative AI, you could get some really cool stuff, right?
And then we got to look at what might happen in the next year or two. And that was your question earlier. One other thing that might happen in the next year or two is not just mice living longer, which people will shrug about and say, well, so what to mouse? It's when our pet dogs live longer. We have a middle-aged dog.
Yeah.
In many families, the people love their dogs more than their spouse. If you ask a woman, will you have to give up on your husband or your dog?
Typical
she'll say,
Brit.
That's right. Kick out the husband. And if the possibility is that the dog, which is going downhill, can have these treatments, rapamycin and lots of other stuff to make its tail bound and chase around, when they see that for the dogs, it'll suddenly help them to realize it could happen for humans too. And that's not necessarily so far away. With the right funding, the mice rejuvenation projects could lead into dog rejuvenation projects and then possibly into simian rejuvenation projects when we look at some relatively short-lived primates. And that's going to build up. And so it's when people can see a plausible step-by-step, and they can already see the first couple of steps have happened, that's what's going to make them cast aside their distractions and say, let's put more attention on this. Private
So
money,
it's- so it's
public money,
dogs.
whatever.
It's dogs rather than mice that are going to get that Oprah Winfrey show off the rails. That's a good idea.
Perhaps, but we need the mice first.
You
to
guys
figure out
know Robert
what
used to
treatments
work on the Oprah for Oprah, don't you?
Did
He had
you?
a digital for
Yes,
Oprah.
that's true. That's true. But apart from popular media, how else do you think we're going to educate the population? And how do you think we get these ideas to percolate through society? Do you have thoughts about changing education? Do you think weirdly education seems to be the slowest
I
thing.
think it's your AI. I think it's your AI is going to be talking to you. You know, you'll do a search and your AI will say, well, actually, you know.
Okay, so let's probe a little deeper on that. Do you think that's going to displace higher education? Do you think people will have this sort of personal, tutor, like the Diamond Age, right? The Neil Stephenson.
Eventually. I don't think, I think it's going to be, like the education system's even slower to change than other industries.
That's
We've
my
talked
point
about that on the show.
Yeah, that's my point. It's very slow.
But, I think it will be the wealthy class will be early adopters of this, and then people will aspire to have their kids trained by an AI, and I think that's how it will happen probably.
And it'll probably happen initially slower than we think, and then eventually faster than we think.
Yeah, exactly.
And education is a slow learner, but it'll get there. And I do like the idea. I really love the idea that we will all eventually have Aristotle as our tutor, like Alexander the Great did. So we'll all be Alexander the Great. And when that happens, kids are going to be so much better educated than we are. It's going to be an amazing time.
Yeah, exactly. And
earlier, Calum, you mentioned that in Europe there's a sort of a dearth of innovation, and we get that here. What we hear from European ministers when we talk to them is they say, well, the Americans get the innovation and we get the unemployment because we have the regulation. So there's been this kind of focus on managing this process of the future and managing technology.
That's actually a bit of a myth. It isn't regulation that's slowing down innovation in Europe. The problem for Europe is that we've got 30 odd countries. We all speak different languages. We have different regulations in each country, and we don't have a single market. There's been a lot of progress towards it, but we're still a long way off it. And that's what makes the big difference. If you do a startup in Alabama, you can sell in New York tomorrow. If you try doing a startup in Trieste, you cannot sell in Paris tomorrow. You've got to go through a whole learning curve, and it's a nightmare.
Tell you what,
that's the main reason.
The direction I was heading there was to talk about open source AI, and it turns out that France is the hotbed of that with Hugging Face and Mistral. So in fact, there is a kind of concentration of talent, but it's not this. It's not the Silicon Valley crowd.
Oh, there's great talent. There's no shortage of talent in Europe. It's the ability to grow scale companies. That's the problem.
And open source is a wild card for all the scenarios we've been talking about on the show, because open source is not the domain of the super wealthy or the tech elite. It's something that could be available to just about anyone who's got some chops. And we're getting open source models now that can run on a smartphone. To bring it all the way back to what David and I were talking about at the beginning of the show, that is the democratization of technology. That's the notion that everyone can have an LLM in their pocket, on a supercomputer in their pocket that's connected to the network. That could be a decisive shift in control. And actually, I think that's the path towards getting to that personal
AI
tutor,
agency.
The Diamond Age scenario where you've got some ultra smart intelligence that's growing with you.
It's conversational. It handles tasks for you. That's how it'll start. It'll be a digital assistant, and then we'll just grow more comfortable with talking about it. It will understand our needs better as it gets more advances and more hooks into different systems. I mean, it's not hard to predict, I think, or forecast. Sorry, David.
But then the $64 billion question or $64 trillion question is who creates and controls and designs that AI? Because if it's serving the needs of a corporation, even though it appears to be decentralized, it could still lead us in a very bad way. So it's a case for democratic control over this open source.
On Hugging Face right now, would you rather have Donald Trump?
Would you rather have Donald Trump in control or Sam Altman?
No, but you're framing it. I don't think that's the right way to frame it. It's not about a politician versus a tech bro. The point is that there are 500,000 open source models today on Hugging Face, and I think it's important for our listeners to understand that this posits an alternative to that scenario of the tech crowd in Silicon Valley facing off against the Chinese government in some dark scenario of the future, struggling to control AI. There is a third scenario, which is massively distributed intelligence in the hands of anyone who's got the skill set not controlled by a single entity, but available to anyone. The true
and think about the
democratization
ability to innovate with that capability, right? And suddenly you don't have the market constraints and so forth. And if you've got UBI in place, then we already have seen in UBI trials that people are far more willing to start their own business on UBI than in the traditional economy. So
I think unquestionably in the next few years there's going to be some incredible businesses and some incredible products and services created by young people and indeed older people using open source models. But the cutting edge of large language models, and that is the name of the game in AI at the moment, require staggering resources beyond even most countries, never mind companies. So it is probably going to be Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, Amazon, and maybe Apple, who are going to develop the cutting edge products for a while. But then, of course, we may have another paradigm. We may get, Brett, you mentioned neuromorphic computing, which has been around for a long time and nobody's ever done it at scale. But actually, a company I'm involved in is looking at trying to do that at scale. And that could be an enormous game changer. One thing we know about technology is it can change on a dime. It moves very fast. And what looks like the established way of things can get overthrown overnight. IBM went, Microsoft came back, Apple went, Apple came back. That sort of thing will keep happening for sure.
But that's the very point that you're making, right? So a moment ago, you were saying that the advantage right now is with these mega corporations, the Microsofts and Googles of the world at the moment.
Right now.
And yet you also just pointed out that very quickly those empires can be overturned and it can be reversed. I think I would urge people not to overlook open source because the gap is being closed. And you're quite right that the current approach is to throw more processing power and larger data sets at these language models. And that's how we've been training them. That's how they've been becoming more capable. But there's also approaches now towards better training on the existing data that we have. Instead of skimming through the book, you actually read and process and understand the book much better. It's quite possible that we're going to be surprised. I think I would not discount the possibility, let's say, call it a black swan event if you want, the idea that the observable default path that large technology companies dominate the future. I think the further you project into the future, the less likely that scenario actually is. I don't think that's such a great default path.
Well, it's also going to become widely unpopular as, you start to see people looking for more consensus-based mechanisms and things like that.
This is Yanis Varoufakis' point in techno-feudalism, right? People are going to rebel against that dominance. We need to wrap up the show.
We need to wrap, guys. We've gone over, but it's like that's when we know we've had a great discussion. So, David and Calum, where can people find out more about the London Futurists, first of all, and secondly, about you both? So, David, you go first.
LondonFuturist.com, or head to the meetup. Or certainly Google just London Futurist podcast.
How often do you have meetups?
Well, I've done them less. And COVID knocked us back a bit. So we do them less often. And even webinars I'm doing a bit less often these days. But the podcast is going from strength to strength because we can have some really fascinating conversations on there, awesome. Just as the four of us have had a fascinating conversation now.
Awesome. Calum?
I'm at calumchace.com. I'm easy to find, CHACE, not SE. And the company I mentioned, which is looking into machine consciousness, is Conscium, CONSCRUM.com.
Great. Thanks for joining us. We'll see if we can, we have the same sort of feeling about, helping people understand what the future is going to be about. That's why we started this podcast. So we're enjoying teaming with you guys, and let's do this more often.
This was fun. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks to see you both. All right, folks. Well, that's it for this week's show. And next week, we'll be back with another set of people who are thinking about and shaping and designing the future. I want to give a big shout out to our crew, the folks at Provoke Media who make the show possible. Thanks to Kevin, Lisbeth, and everyone else at Provoke Media. And a big word of gratitude to our listeners. Recently, I've been getting great posts on social media and feedback to our shows. So thank you for that kind of guidance and support. That means a tremendous amount to us. If you like the show, please do share it with a friend. Please give us a 5-star review. That helps other people find the show. And if you have ideas or thoughts or suggestions for speakers or the kinds of questions you'd like us to ask them, be sure to send that to us on social as well, because we do pay attention to that. Every week, we'll bring you someone who is thinking about and shaping the future. And until then, well, we will see you
in the future.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did, please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.